On today's video, we are going to be doing some closed water trolling for walleyes. Hey there, outdoor YouTubers. It's Dave Knetter from Knetter's Practical Outdoors. And like I said earlier, today's video is going to be about trolling for walleyes. Now, for a lot of you walleye fishermen and fisherwomen, when you think about trolling for walleyes, you might be thinking about open water trolling, right? Bigger bodies of water, line counter reels, throwing out crankbaits or maybe spinners and crawlers, maybe getting a big planer board spread out there and searching around for these somewhat nomadic schools of walleyes. But today's video is going to be more about trolling a little bit shallower water and trolling where the terrain changes quite quickly. Now, I know you planer board guys, you tend to stay away from that sort of stuff, right? There's nothing worse than getting that 6 planer board spread out and you're trolling in 20 feet of water and then the bottom comes up and you're in 4 feet of water and your lures are all fouled up and you're reeling everything in and you're kind of starting over. Or you're going along with that big planer board spread again and all of a sudden there's a patch of weeds that comes right up to the surface. All your lines are fouled. Again, you're reeling in, cleaning your baits, and you're starting over from scratch again. That's no fun when you got that big planer board spread out, right? So I know a lot of you planer board guys kind of stay away from that quickly changing terrain. And if you're catching fish, keep doing it, right? That's the name of the game. But for a lot of the lakes that I fish, they're kind of smaller. And again, there's a lot of quickly changing terrain. And I don't just mean depth changes, right? I mean, that's part of it. But it could be, like I said earlier, it could be you're trolling over the tops of weeds. The tops are 10 feet down. And all of a sudden, bonk, there's a patch that comes right up to the surface. Or there might be stumps or brush that I'm trolling in and around. And sometimes you're getting snagged up, okay? And, you planer board guys know, even if it's just one line snagged up, that's a problem. Because now you're reeling everything in, you're spinning around, and again, you're starting over. So the trolling that I'm talking about today, it's kind of the opposite of open water trolling, okay? So sometimes I'll refer to it as closed water trolling. Shallower water and quickly changing terrain. Okay, so if the lakes that you guys are fishing kind of fall into that category, right? Where the depth changes quite a bit, there's weeds, there might be stumps, there might be brush, but that's where the walleyes are. Kind of want to get in there and catch them, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to abandon all of the techniques that a lot of guys use for open water trolling, but we're going to change them up a little bit. Well, one of the first things I do when I'm closed water trolling that's a little bit different than open water trolling is the main focus is on lines that I'm trolling directly behind the back of the boat. A lot of the lakes I fish, I really like to have direct control over the rod. And that means I want to be able to watch that rod tip to kind of see what that lure's doing down there. And it also means I want to be able to pick that rod up out of the rod holder and reel more line in or let more line out, depending on what's kind of going on below me. And a lot of that direct control is kind of lost if all your lures are running behind planer boards. Remember, we're talking about trolling in shallower water with abrupt changes to the terrain. If my lure starts dragging bottom, I want to be able to see that in the tip of the rod. If my lure picks up a weed, I also want to be able to see that in the tip of the rod. If I'm going over a small hump, I might want to grab the rod right out of the rod holder, pick it up for a little bit till I get over that hump, and then set it back down. Or I may want to reel some line in so the lure's not running as deep. I may want to let some line out if it's getting a little deeper and I want that lure to run a little deeper. And you can really get a good feel by watching the rod tip, right? That rod tip will kind of develop sort of a cadence when that lure's down there running free and clean. And you can kind of get used to that cadence, and then if it picks up a little bit of a weed, A lot of times it'll just stop with that vibrating or pulsing, and you know you got to reel in, clear that weed off, and get your lure back out again. Or sometimes if you notice your crankbait picked up a weed because you've kind of lost that pulse, sometimes you can just give the rod a good jerk and you can pull it free. Okay, these are just a lot of things that you're really not able to do if all your lures are running behind planer boards. Now, another thing that I do maybe a little bit different when I'm doing this closed water trolling is I actually completely ditch these level wind line counting reels. Okay, and I know that's weird to a lot of you planer board open water guys, okay, but it's just too slow when you're picking up weeds and debris, getting snags. Okay, now remember, there's a lot of train changes that we're dealing with, so we are reeling these lines in a lot and clearing weeds off, debris, zebra mussels maybe, or we're actually getting snags and we're turning around and getting them out, okay, and then we're putting the lines back out again. So we really want to be quick, so I really like to utilize spinning gear for that. Okay, so I reel it in, get that weed off, and I can cast it right back out again instead of the time that it takes to kind of feed the line out with these line counter reels. Now, I know a lot of you open water guys really depend on these line counter reels, okay, when you're out trolling with these crankbaits. That tells you how much line is out, and then that kind of dictates how deep that crankbait will dive. But that line count isn't that important for this closed water trolling. Remember, we're trolling through areas where the bottom, the terrain is constantly changing, whether it's weeds, whether it's depth changes, okay? So the amount of line that you're letting out would change constantly. So having that repeatability to get the crankbait back out there at the exact same depth doesn't mean as much to me. But when I'm doing this closed water trolling, the benefits of being able to cast that lure out, get it out in the water a lot quicker, kind of outweigh the benefit of knowing exactly how many feet of line you have out. Now, that's not to say that I don't pay some attention to the amount of line I have out, right? Okay, so when we're casting these lines out, right, we're getting them out there quick because we're casting, but we try to make the casts somewhat consistent, right? We don't try to like heave it as hard as we can and then sometimes have a little longer cast, or maybe we're kind of lazy on the next cast and it's quite a bit shorter. You know, we do try to be consistent with the cast, right? We cast out, try to make it consistent, get a feel for, you know, where that's landing behind the boat when you're casting it out, and that's kind of a reference point to start. And then we'll kind of go from there, because sometimes one cast length is not going to be enough to get that lure down to where I want it. So when I think that I need more line out, besides just that one consistent cast length, I'll count out what I call rips. Okay, so you cast out, all right, you got that crankbait running behind you, bail's still open, and under kind of a tight line, as I'm going along, the boat's going this way, forward trolling, I'll kind of grab the rod and I'll put my finger on the spool and I'll bring it forward under a tight line, and then of course the line comes off, and I call that one rip. All right, maybe I want to go a little further, so I'll let the crankbait and the momentum of the boat take up the slack under a tight line. I'll bring it forward again, and that'll be two rips. So even though we're not using line counter reels, we are kind of paying attention to how much line is going out, and we kind of have sort of a rough system so we can do some repeatability. So when we're setting the lines out, my kids will always ask me, how much line are we letting out? And I'll check the depth. You know, I kind of got a feel, say we're using this crankbait. Okay, we're in 12 feet of water. That's going to be our cast plus two rips. After a while, you kind of get a feel for the lures you use, the depth that you're running, that consistent cast plus your amount of rips. You'll kind of get a feel for how much to let out, so you can have a little bit of repeatability depending on the depth. Now, I know a lot of you planer board guys are saying, hey, if you're trolling around in shallow water and you've just got a couple lines straight back behind the boat, all you're doing is running over these fish, scaring them off to the sides before your crankbaits even get to them. And of course, that is the advantage of using planer boards, right? If you are spooking some fish from your boat, they do kind of scoot off to the sides, and maybe they run right into those lines that you have off to the side of the boat, or the lines that you have off to the side of the boat, they're cruising along and they're presenting that crankbait in front of fish that haven't been spooked by the boat at all. But I do believe under a lot of conditions, even in shallow water, you can run fish over and still catch them even without planer boards. And I'll go ahead and I'll share some of my theories on this subject with you guys. Okay, so what does a minnow do when it feels threatened by a larger predator fish? Okay, generally speaking, it's either going to hide or it's going to flee, right? It's going to hide or it's going to run. So when your boat comes trolling along, these walleyes that are kind of in and around it, they become the minnows or the bait fish, and your boat becomes the larger predator fish. So these walleyes are either going to hide or run. Now, if these walleyes are up on a sand flat in 10 feet of water, maybe feeding on some perch, okay, and here you come and you run them over, all right, if it's calm out, if the water is clear, if there's really no weeds or brush around for them, there is a good chance they're going to scoot off to the sides, and those fish will be difficult to catch if you just have lines straight behind the boat. But if those same fish have some cover to hide in, I do believe they're a lot less likely to take off to the sides, okay? And cover can mean a lot of things. It can mean stained water. It can mean a little chop on the water that's casting shadows all over. It can mean low light conditions because of the morning or the evening. It can mean weeds. It can mean rocks. It can mean brush piles, okay? It can mean a depth change, an edge, a dark bottom. If there's any of that cover down there, I do believe those fish are much more likely just to kind of hunker down in that cover. Your boat goes overhead. 30 seconds later, they forgot all about it, and along comes this crankbait, and that walleye decides to have lunch. So I do believe there are a lot of conditions where you can troll right over the tops of walleyes, even in shallow water, still catch them with lines straight back behind the boat. Now, having said all that, if we do go back to that first scenario, right, where the walleyes are up on this sand flat, the water's clear, the surface is calm, all right, there's not really any cover for them. Again, you run those walleyes over, they probably are scooting off to the sides, all right? So sometimes we're just going to want to catch those fish. So I do still incorporate planer boards into my closed water trolling. But even though I'm using some planer boards, I'm still doing it a little bit different than the traditional open water big planer board spreads. The first thing that I do that's a little different, and I know this is going to be really wacky, and some of you guys are going to think I'm nuts, but I actually will still use spinning gear for my closed water planer board use. And I know for a lot of you guys this is just absolute crazy talk to think about using spinning gear with a planer board. But remember, we're still trolling in relatively shallow water, and we're still trolling where there's a lot of changes in the terrain. So I still want to be able to reel this in quickly, clear off weeds, clear off debris, cast it back out, snap that planer board on, and get that line back out as soon as possible. Okay, another thing that I'm doing different is I'm not putting out a big spread, you know, like 4 or 6 planer boards. I'm usually using 1 planer board, maybe 2. Remember, we're still dealing with these terrain changes, quick changes in depth, or maybe weeds that come to the surface, and it's just too big of a hassle to deal with more than 1 or 2 planer boards when you're trolling areas like that. Now, when I do use spinning gear with these planer boards, you know, I do use stuff that's a little bit beefier. This big, thick, ugly stick rod really works good. I like to use 15 or 20 pound test braid, right? You don't want to be using like 8 pound test mono if you're going to be running a planer board. Planer board clips can put a little bit of stress on your line. So I do like to use 15 or 20 pound test braid. And you guys know these ugly sticks, right? They're supposed to be all like unbreakable. So they can handle that constant pulsing and jostling that those planer boards put on rods. And, you know, for these smaller lakes that I'm fishing, you know, a little bit beefier spinning gear like that is really all you need, even to fish with planer boards. One of my favorite ways to incorporate planer boards into this closed water trolling is to be contour trolling, maybe following a shoreline, following a certain depth, and I'll run 1 planer board in towards shore. I'll put a shallow diver on it, you know, something like this. Run that behind the planer board, you know, in closer to shore, and then straight off the back of the boat, I'll run some stuff that dives a little bit deeper. And I'll just kind of troll along like that, and sometimes that can be really effective for these walleyes that are relating to the shoreline. I remember one year there was this lake I was fishing, and there was pods of walleyes relating to the shoreline, and I would go along and I would troll like that with that one planer board to the inside, okay? And after a while, I even quit running the line straight behind the boat because they would never get bit. So I would go along just with that one planer board, and if I caught a fish, I would actually stop and then I would cast toward them, because a lot of times there was pods of fish in certain spots. And sometimes I'd pick up another one or two. Sometimes you wouldn't. Then I'd get that bait back out there, get that planer board back out there, and start cruising along the shorelines again, searching for another pot of fish. And that was a really good pattern for about 1 or 2 weeks, I remember. And I caught a lot of fish doing it like that. So in that scenario, I was kind of using the one planer board as a search tool to find out where the walleyes were. Okay, so closed water trolling. You don't really necessarily need real specialized equipment, okay? You don't really need the line counter reels. In fact, like I told you earlier, I actually think they're too slow, okay? I just can't get the baits back in the water quick enough with them, so I kind of go without them. Now, if you don't have any planer boards, I would recommend maybe going out and buying just one and see if it helps you out on the lakes that you fish, okay? For many years, I ran these offshore planer boards. I think I bought 4 of these like 24 years ago. Caught a lot of fish with these. Now recently, I have gone ahead and bought a couple of these yellowbirds. As you can see, these are a little bit smaller, so they're maybe a little bit more suited to this closed water trolling. All right. And another thing is these release clips on these pretty old offshore planer boards were kind of getting dried out, and they maybe weren't working out quite as good as I wanted them to. And these newer release clips, and I know offshore makes a really good release clip these days too, but these newer release clips really clamp down really good on the line. They work great, even with smaller diameter braids. So I went ahead and I bought a couple of these yellowbirds, and I'm really happy with them. Like I say, they're kind of a mid-sized planer board, at least this size is. The release clips are fantastic. They clamp down really good. Or even these mini planer boards, these really work well too, especially for a little bit smaller spinning gear maybe. Maybe some of you guys don't have beefier spinning gear or the line counting reels or the big planer board rods and reels. So these mini planer boards can really work good for some of this inland closed water trolling too. I know I must use these planer boards in a lot of smaller lakes where people aren't used to seeing them, because just the other night I was out trolling with this, and I was going by this other boat, and I could hear a little kid in the boat ask his dad, "Hey, why is that guy pulling a mailbox behind his boat?" Now I know a lot of you open water guys, right? It's kind of ideal to have 3 people in the boat when you're doing that, right? One guy's driving the boat, one guy's reeling the fish in, and that third guy is pulling the planer boards off and netting the fish, right? It's kind of ideal to have 3 people in the boat. Well, occasionally when I'm out closed water trolling, I am by myself. So I'm driving the boat, I'm letting the lines out, I'm clipping the planer boards on, I'm hooking the fish, I'm reeling them in, I'm unclipping the planer board, all while still driving the boat, and then I'm netting the fish too. So I'm kind of doing all those jobs by myself. Now, even though over the years I've gotten to be kind of okay at doing that when I'm fishing by myself, I did tell my wife, if this video gets over 100,000 views, I am going to go out and I am going to buy an iPilot bow mount electric. Okay, so at least that iPilot can do the driving for me. Now, my wife did kind of laugh when I told her that, because not very many of my videos actually get 100,000 views. But you know what, guys? Let's prove her wrong. Now, throughout this video, I've mostly been referring to trolling with crankbaits. But of course, a lot of these techniques will work with any kind of bait you want to troll. They'll work with spinners and crawlers. They'll certainly work with crankbaits. And also, another thing that I like to troll sometimes is a flatfish with a crawler behind it. There are certain times when I want to really slow down when I'm trolling, and that flatfish really works well for that. Now, if you're at all interested in how I kind of modify these flatfish out to accommodate a crawler, I did do an entire separate video on that subject. And if you're interested in that, I will leave a link below in the description of this video so you can check that out. For some of you open water guys that are out there killing the fish with your planer board spreads, just keep doing that, all right? But for some of you guys, you know, if you're fishing some of these smaller lakes, or you're fishing near shore, or you're fishing where the terrain changes a lot, sometimes that's where the fish are, okay? So sometimes we got to go in there and get them. So hopefully some of these tips and techniques for closed water trolling might help you out, all right? If you guys enjoyed the content, be sure to like and subscribe. And also, remember to hunt fish, laugh, repeat. This is Dave Knetter from Knetter's Practical Outdoors. Hey, thanks for watching. God bless.